first question that we might want to have for us, for the group that we have co-created is, how is space law going to be different from Earth law? Or maybe you know already something about the space laws and you know what the differences are, but basically we are here and we are going to the space. So maybe we might want to think, what do we want to bring with us into the space? Do we all want to colonialize, or do we all want to just copy paste the legal frameworks that we have? So let's see. We're going to have 2 people per breakout room. There is at least, yes, there is many of us. And the question, again, as it was proposed by Samir, how is space law going to be different from the Earth laws?
Now's your chance to explore. And I would suggest maybe breakout rooms of 3 people, Anya, just
Sure.
in case there's one person who doesn't quite make it. But how is space law different from Earth law? And if you don't know, how should it be different? What do you think? In space, how is it different from here? Now's your chance to explore. So if the tech host could open up the breakout rooms, awesome.
Thank you.
For about 8 minutes. All right, I think everyone's coming back from their breakout rooms here. Everyone is back, I think. Excellent. I joined a breakout room as well, exploring this question, what's the difference between space law and Earth law? And I have to say, there's some things that came up that I have not been thinking about that are actually really quite important. So I'd love to invite anyone who's here who would join one of the conversations, if you would like to, just to share with the rest of us some of the things that emerged, some of the interesting points that you talked about. Is there anyone that wants to share? If you do, please just feel free to unmute your microphone. And yeah, Farzad, I see you raising your hand, please.
Thank you. I had a conversation with Dejan from Ethiopia, and hi everyone, I'm very glad to be here. The point I tried to make was that some of the differences between so-called Earth law and space law is rather understandable due to the restraints and barriers in technology and the circumstances we live in. The moment we actually do establish life in space on another planet or on the moon and so on and so forth, I think like my approach initially would be that instantly and automatically some of the current legal regimes currently in force on Earth should have to stretch and extend to how the circumstances are being designed and implemented and imposed in space. For instance, the geographical scope of international environmental law at the moment is whatever there is below biosphere. That makes sense, at least it does to me, because there is no life allegedly above that. But as soon as there is life in our sphere of influence, I think that international environmental law, just as an example, should extend to the domain that life has been established in space. That's one point we thought of and talked about. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Farzad. There's an interesting insight there of some laws that we think we can bring with us to space. Is there anyone else that would like to share what came up in their conversation? Many of you don't have the cameras on, so I can't see any raised hands, but if you would like to, just unmute yourself and share with us some insight that you had, or maybe a question that came up.
We were talking with Lisa about a very small island country, Montserrat, and apparently they're having some issues as a small country being responsible for rockets that are being launched by the big countries. And we explored that question a bit further on and figured out that a lot of times what small countries are used to, for example, French Guiana, I mean, Kazakhstan is perhaps not really an example of a small country, but French Guiana, Montserrat, Kazakhstan, some of the other islands, and possibly even some pads on the open sea, those are being used for the launching of the rockets. And how the laws are now being created is basically that you have a shared responsibility. So all of a sudden you can have a big country launching the rocket from your land, and then you're going to be sharing that responsibility if anything goes wrong with the rocket, with a big country that actually procured the launch, that has the finances to afford that launching, to afford the building of the rocket, to afford going into space, while you really just provide that pad to launch the rocket. And why, for example, a lot of times these countries are being used is that in Europe or in populated areas in the continents, you have not only the population but also the infrastructure. And to launch such a rocket, you need an empty space, a lot of it, so that you minimize the risk of causing any damages if there goes something wrong with the launching. And this is an interesting concept because it's been established with space laws for years. So the shared responsibility with those who procure and with those who actually offer you to launch the rocket.
Thank you, Anya, for sharing that. I know you had an interesting panel yesterday about space laws with some people who had some quite insightful things to say about space law and how it's actually been around for quite some time, surprisingly, and people have been thinking about it. Is there anyone else that would like to share with the rest of us here what came up in their conversations? Otherwise, I would, if not, then I would love to invite you in the chat to just write down any questions that came in your conversation that come to mind now when it comes to space law. What are some things that we have to consider? What's a question that you have? A question that I have that came up, for example, was how do we create space law in a way that we don't repeat sort of the gaps of the law that we have here on Earth? How do we start afresh in space without taking and starting from the foundation that we have here, that we're trying to negotiate differently already? So if you have any questions that came up, please do share them in the chat, and maybe it will inspire the next breakout session. So just take 2 minutes, please, to write down a question that you may have. I see Anya has shared her question. It's an interesting one. Really, who owns the moon? It's a good question. Anyone else have any questions that came up?
Well, who does own the moon? The resident space law expert in the room. Who does own the moon, Anya?
The whole humanity, Margaret.
No, really.
Okay. Yeah, for real.
But you know that well, you've shared with me that there's a space treaty, there's an outer space treaty.
So the Outer Space Treaty, which was created in 1967, pretty much proclaimed or has this non-appropriation article, the Article 3, which says along the lines that all the space bodies, including celestial bodies and the moon, actually belong to the whole humankind and are pretty much proclaimed to be the province of all mankind, meaning you cannot really go there, put a flag on it, and then say, hey, this is now the US land. The problem is that since the US kind of landed there, and since there's quite some successful landing places on the moon, people still want to show that that is now land that should be protected. Some people are even saying that we should have physical museums there, and we should forever protect this land and never land on that same spot ever again, or perhaps do anything with it. But also what the treaties are saying is that if you are mining the whole thing and you are extracting the minerals, you can then own those minerals. And the problem now becomes, if I have an asteroid, a small celestial body, sure, I won't be claiming it to be mine, but I can extract all the minerals from that celestial body and claim the minerals to be mine. And now I actually appropriated it by use. Now, non-appropriation principle still says that it should not be appropriated by use either way. And there's always going to be responsibility of whomever does that. And the countries are still very much on the same page when it comes to, hey, we need to have a model in place on how are we going to be redistributing these resources. So if only one country has the capacity to go in there and to extract the minerals and to, put the flag into the land, it still should belong to all humankind. And I think that that is actually something that we lawyers usually perceive as the customary international rule of law, meaning that it has been around for such a long time and it has always been respected by so many different stakeholders that it is perceived to be a very strong rule. And even if you have now a bilateral agreement in place with another country, that can not forgotten and it cannot just be avoided.
Hmm.
So literally, the moon belongs to all humankind.
But I think it does raise an interesting question, Anya, and I'm sure the people here, some people have different opinions of who should own the moon, or what that brings up in their own minds. And in fact, I think it might be a good question to take into a breakout room just to reflect with each other. Who should own the moon? And I think there's maybe 2 time horizons that you can think that of. So now, where we are now, and given the current given circumstances of space, and what if we are a spacefaring civilization, incredibly advanced, and but I'm seeing that Margaret is sharing that we have another session now, which is starting.
Don't we have
In a minute.
in 1 minute?
In 1 minute. Apologies. I did not take note of that. So that's a question we can all take home and reflect on with our friends and the other people here. It is still a good one though. Who should own the moon?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So, well, on that note, I think we can close this session off, and invite the next session, which is, I believe, the future of international commercial arbitration, moderated by Andrew.